So without further ado, the man of the hour, the person we've been waiting for, I want to introduce you to our good friend, Mr. Bill Federer. He is a historian and he knows his stuff. And so thank you for coming all the way from Florida to talk to us. And we appreciate you. God bless you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Bill. And I have the highest respect for Bill and Deborah Owens and the tremendous work they've been doing for the Lord. And Bill, you've been an inspiration to me for decades. And thank you for being articulate and having a backbone and jumping into the national fights for what's right and doing press conferences. And just want to thank you for your friendship, Bill.
Thank you.
And with that, I did a book. It's called Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present. And the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. And so I'm going to share this history and you'll see some patterns that relate to what's going on today. So my website's AmericanMinute.com. And anyway, so 380 BC, Athens, Plato writes in passing about Atlantis, this highly structured civilization, very organized on an island that sinks in the ocean. Now, whether it existed or not, he thought it did. And this could have been Santorini, which is an island in the Mediterranean that used to be a volcano island, and it blew up in a distant past that would have sent a tsunami across the Mediterranean, wiping out lots of civilizations. It's a great tourist place. I've been there back in college. Anyway, so Plato considered Atlantis the ideal structured society, and Plato considered a democracy an unstructured society. Demos means people, crassy means rule, and the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. He says the state is like a bazaar, which you can buy anything, like a piece of embroidery, which all the manners of men, the greatest variety of human natures. But then it begins to tolerate people that are a little bit off. And then they begin to tolerate people that are a lot off. Until finally it begins to verge on lawlessness. And so he says, such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder. And then he says that the manner of life is that of Democrats. Now, he's describing a democracy, and so every man does what is right in his own eyes. And so now we're tolerating anybody doing anything, and the father gets accustomed to descending to the level of his son, and to fear them, and the son having no shame or fear of his parents. So now they're tolerating disrespect in the home. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise the masters and tutors. So now they're tolerating disrespect in the classroom. Citizens then vote to take the money from the city treasury and spread the wealth around. And now the treasury is empty, and so they vote to take the money from the rich. He says the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. And then it gets into tolerating immorality in the home. And the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. Yes, that's what he's talking about. He has parted company with all shame. And so democracy's insatiable desire brings her to disillusion. So they tolerate people that are a little bit off, then they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating lawlessness. Now it's interesting, the sexual aspect, where they're now tolerating the young men getting into useless and unnecessary pleasures. So an Oxford anthropologist, J.D. Unwin, wrote a book in 1934 called Sex and Culture. And he studied Athens as well as 80 different civilizations over 5,000 years. And he found out that loosening of sexual restraints always precedes the destruction of a civilization. He says that people go through a period, when you're studying these 80 civilizations, they have a pattern. And it's four things. One is the people go through a period of pain and poverty. Maybe like a war, maybe like a famine. In Israel's case, right, there were slaves for 400 years. But then they come out of that and they begin to be productive. And they work hard. And then all of them begin to get productive and they end up becoming patriotic. And rising water floats all boats, and the whole society begins to get prosperous. And then they get expansionistic and explorative and so forth. But then once they achieve that, they get pleasure focused. and they want to enjoy their pleasure and their prosperity, and then they get promiscuous and indulgent, and the discipline lulls weaken, and then they get conquered by the next rising civilization. Sort of like an athlete, when he's young, he's disciplined and focuses and exercises and watches his diet, and he wants that championship. And finally he gets it, and he's the champ for a couple seasons. And then he gets a little lazy, doesn't exercise as much, doesn't watch his diet as much, and then he gets challenged into the ring of competition, and he gets the tar knocked out of him, because in reality he's a couch potato, you know? And so that's what happens with these societies. Now, J.D. Unwin even called it a sexual marketplace. He says the women as a whole, if they say nothing happens unless there's a commitment, the guys say, well, whatever it takes. And the next thing you know, there's little kids, and the guy has this new experience of wanting to be protective and productive for his wife and family. And when all the men of the country become protective and productive, again, rising water floats all boats, the country becomes protective and productive. But if the women as a whole say there does not need to be a commitment, then water seeks its own level. You'll have a bunch of guys saying, hey, get some pleasure, I don't have to make any commitments. And when enough of the guys begin to move in this direction, there's irresponsibility, and there's less kids being born to fill the ranks of the military, and the whole society gets weakened, and then it collapses. And so this is a predictable, observable trend that sexual promiscuity always precedes the decline of a civilization. John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. And so, Harry S. Truman put it this way, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So when they reach this anarchy, when they reach this unstructured society mess, then the people look for someone to come along and fix it and restore structure. And so a governor comes along and he says, I can fix it, I just need some emergency powers. And so Plato says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he is a protector. He's full of smiles. And he says, I'm going to take away some of your rights and freedoms, but I'm doing this to protect you. And the people give him up, and they give him up. And finally, if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he'll have a good pretext for destroying them. The protector standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. Right? So now the veil's off, he's just another dictator. And having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood. So he incites a mob to go out and attack his political opponents. So Plato said democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue. And if you give people a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up the virtue to save their life. And so he says it's just a matter of time till this thing collapses. Now, ancient Israel's experiment of self-rule lasted a little bit longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God, and people were virtuous because they were accountable to him in the next life. Athens didn't have that. Athens, by Plato's time, had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so, Plato even said this, if a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He said, people really aren't virtuous. If anybody was born that really had virtue, the world would crucify him. He wrote that in 380 BC. Wow, isn't that interesting? Anyway, so Plato says the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. And he's the head of gold. And his arms and chest, or his administrative and military class are the arms and chest of silver. Together they make up the ruling class, and they're going to do what? Institute structure. And everybody else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They are the peasants, and they're the ruled class. So socialism is a social structure to society of a deep state ruling class, and then everybody that's ruled. And now the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoners. They can do things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. And the ruled class, everybody is provided for. And no one owns any property. There are no families. The government decides who gets to have children. This is Plato. And the government takes the children away from the parents.
Wow.
The children are socialized in government schools where they learn how to give up their parents' values and just obey and serve the ruling class state.
Wow.
And Plato wrote it this way: when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order, right? Structure. They'll set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And so the children are taught noble lies. He actually says the kids will be taught lies. We want one single grand lie, which will be believed by everybody. So here they're going to destroy the family, get rid of the parents, take the kids in, bring them into the schools, and teach them lies. And now Plato was 380 BC. Now let's fast forward to 1516. This is just 20 years or so after Columbus discovers America. So there's new lands, and they're realizing, hey, we can set up new societies. And so Thomas More writes a book in England called The Island of Utopia. And it's a fictitious island somewhere off the coast of Brazil, South America. Supposedly Amerigo Vespucci discovered it. It does not exist. The word utopia means nowhere. And it's written as a Greek dialogue, like a conversation, with a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So here you have the island of nowhere told to us by the peddler of nonsense. And on this island, modeled after Atlantis, it's perfectly structured. There's the upper class rulers, the lower class commoners. There's free healthcare. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's free common meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in free identical 3-story housing. There's no locks on any doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse. There's no taverns, no alehouses, no coffee houses, no places for private gathering, no privacy. The government tracks everyone everywhere they go with an internal passport. And the government decides everyone's careers, that you have to work for the rest of your life. And there's no families. Back to that, right? The childbearing is regulated by the government. And sort of like China's one-child policy, or Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger, who said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. So this is utopia, this perfectly structured society, right? And that inspired, by the way, Thomas More wrote it as a veiled attack against Henry VIII, who was the King of England, who switched from being Catholic to Protestant, and whoever didn't turn on a dime and switch with him, he killed. And so this was this totalitarian, and Sir Thomas More couldn't come out publicly and criticize Henry, or he'd be killed, so he did it sort of veiled with this book, Utopia. Henry VIII, nevertheless, did kill Sir Thomas More. Well, Plato's Island of Atlantis, Thomas More's Utopia, inspired Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. He makes no qualms about it. He names it New Atlantis, directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. And this is a fictitious island in the South Pacific. A little more scientific careers that everybody has, because the scientific revolution had started by this time. But it's highly structured. There's the ruling class, there's the commoners, the government dictates everything. Someone wrote a satire on this. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Here's Gulliver washed up on an island of Lilliput and finds out it's highly structured. There's this ruling class that controls everybody's life down to the little minutia. And then the ruled class where they just simply have to work their jobs and they have no say about it. Why is this important? The Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were originally a company colony with bylaws written by investors that put up the money for their boat trip. And the investors, sure enough, looked back to Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon. Okay, we're going to set up a new society, and let's do it really great. Let's have everything owned in common, and right. So they're modeling it after Plato, and the pilgrims almost starved to death. So the pilgrim bylaws say this: all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel, and all provision out of ye common stock. Well, guess what? Didn't work. William Bradford, the governor of the Pilgrims, wrote, "The failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times." The Pilgrim governor literally mentions Plato. He knew that they were trying to live out, so it's theoretical, Plato and Sir Thomas More, it's all theoretical. They're trying to actually live the thing out. And nobody wanted to go out and plant. That the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men, who were most able and fit for service, objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc. with the humbler and younger ones thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Governor Bradford goes on, "Let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God, in his wisdom, saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop than they had done, so they might not continue and endure the misery of want. After length, at much discussion, the governor allowed each man to plant corn for his own household." Wow, what a novel idea. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So we have the pilgrims trying to live out this theoretical owning stuff in common, and they scrapped it. Now, what if older fish could pass history onto younger fish, saying things like, "Stay away from shiny things dangling in the water"? But they can't. So every new generation of baby fish sees this shiny thing and they're attracted to it. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free healthcare, free housing, free education. Free is attractive. And they're drawn to it only to find out there's a hook. Now, didn't the early church own everything in common? Well, very important difference between voluntary and involuntary and church versus government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their land, and they laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to redistribute. They were not involuntarily forced to sell their land and have it taken away and laid at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. Right? Now, voluntary versus involuntary is a big thing with God, right? It's called charity, right? And now, if you own things, you can be moved upon in your heart to give some of those things away. That's called charity. If you do not own anything, you cannot be charitable. And so the Bible, the children of Israel coming to the promised land, every family gets a plot of land. And so God's into giving people things, and then the material world is a way for you to express the spiritual heart that you have. You manifest what's in your heart. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase to communism. And Marx said communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. Right? So we got God giving property to the children of Israel, and then people being moved upon to give some of it away to rebuild the temple and so forth. there's a confusion over the role of government. God gives commands to 5 groups in the Bible. Individuals, families, business, church, and government. There are commands for individuals to take care of the poor. There's relatively few commands for the family. Most of the family commands are husbands love your wives, children submit to your parents. There are taking care of a relative that's in need, right? Or you're worse than an infidel. And business. Most of those commands are do an honest day's work, don't hold back wages. There is leave the corners of your fields for the poor people to pick through. But the church definitely has commands to take care of the poor. And historically, the church has. And the church fed the orphans and the widows and started hospitals and medical clinics and dug wells in villages. And most of the hospitals were started by churches. And, the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, but then all the other denominations. The churches started schools. There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. The command of the government's the shortest. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. Now, whenever the church helps anybody, it wants that person to get out of their bad situation, become better off. Why? So they can help the next needy person that comes along. Whenever the government helps people, it does it in exchange for something. So you're in Egypt, you need food, the government comes along and says, we'll give you food, but it's in exchange for your cattle. It's in exchange for your land, in exchange for your children, for your very lives. All right? It's control over. Calvin Coolidge says, it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. We need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do. It's not the government's job. It's the church's job. It's the individual's job. If they're related to somebody, it's that family's responsibility. Gerald Ford said this, people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? And so socialism can take over a country 2 ways. You come in with tanks, or you give away free stuff and get everybody indebted to you. It's like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood 2 ways. You can come in with guns or give away free drugs and get everybody hooked.
That's right.
So the Pilgrims, they switch from company to covenant. What's the difference? Involuntary versus voluntary. So instead of you having it involuntary taken away and some government redistributed, now you get it and you get to voluntarily care for your brothers. And so this covenant is adopted from ancient Israel, and it's people in agreement with each other, but more than an agreement, it's a commitment to caring for each other. Why? Because you're accountable to God. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. And then you get your rights from God. The Pilgrims were so into this, and the Puritans, that they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. This is the Yale coat of arms to this day. It's got Hebrew characters on it, right? Truth and light. And so we look at the Hebrew model. Power wants to concentrate. So basically, all government is on a spectrum, either total government or no government. Total government, you get a dictator where he rules through fear. No government is anarchy unless the people have morals or virtue. So you increase the virtue, you increase the freedom. And so in Israel's case, everybody was taught the law. And it was like everybody downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. Imagine, instead of a GPS app telling you to turn left 50 yards ahead, it's a behavioral app. And it says, don't steal that off that table, I see you looking at it, or don't lose your temper at that person, right? In real time. And the Levites are the computer geeks that help you to download the app, right? You don't need a policeman following you around, you got the app. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel introduced the key ingredient. There is a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He is going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something, nobody's around, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. Mm-hmm. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. right? And so now, God knew that the Israelites would break the law, and rather than them walking around the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, once a year, they'd have the Day of Atonement, where they would have the sacrifice, where everybody's sins would be forgiven, right? For the last year, they start off the next year with a clean slate. Obviously, that's foreshadowing Jesus. Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue, because there's no prompting of the conscience. Without God, laws are just a bunch of things that some old men made up somewhere, right? So if you get rid of God, then all you got left is the bunch of laws that somebody made up, and you follow them as long as it's socially acceptable to follow. But then some are going to say, forget this, and they're going to start robbing and stealing. They're going to yield to that lawless side, right? They're going to tolerate all kinds of behavior. It's going to turn into chaos, and then they're all going to say, we need someone to come along and fix this mess. And in Israel's case, they got Saul. So we look at self-government, democracies and republics, rest upon the people having self-control, virtue, morals, and to be educated, which rests upon people motivated to be moral because they're accountable to God. Watching everyone, wants you to be fair, going to hold you accountable. But if you get rid of God, and people become ignorant, and then it's going to crumble, and there's going to be lawlessness and chaos, and then people are going to say, we want someone to come along and fix it, and that's when the freedom is going to be taken away, and the protector promises to fix it, and ends up being a tyrant. So what happened with ancient Israel? The priests stopped teaching the law. So here's Eli, the high priest, the main guy that's supposed to be teaching it. His sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. Talk about sexual promiscuity. And then there is a Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah, and you're reading the story, scratching your head, saying, a Levite with a graven image. Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have graven images? So the Levites weren't following the law. And then another story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman he's not even married to. Again, sexual promiscuity. And sodomites come along, bang on the door. The poor girl's raped to death. And by the time you're grossed out, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Where have we seen that before, right? Yeah. This idea, it's this total lawlessness. There's no morals. And so it's an unstructured chaos. Out of that, they all go to Samuel the prophet. And Samuel cries, and the Lord says, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Yeah. And so they get their tyrant named Saul. Now, story, Saul is pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David. He turns to his soldiers. None of you soldiers care about me. One guy, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care. I saw David go to this town called Nob. The priests gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. Saul says, bring those priests to me. When they show up, he turns to his men and says, kill them. The men hesitate. Doeg the Edomite says, I'll kill him. Goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system where every person is accountable to God to follow the law. The law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one witness, this Doeg guy. So the soldiers are hesitating. They still have a conscience. Yeah. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. You tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. You tell me there's no more male, female. You tell me I can go to any bathroom I want. You fluid sex, whatever. I'm just a bunch of mush. You tell me to get rid of the color yellow, I'll get rid of everything yellow. When you blow the trumpets, I'll bow to your statue. Tyrants always want to insert themselves between you and God. They want to be the interpreter of the morals. And so, question, is socialism really a counterfeit church, like an anti-church? Right? It says, we want to take care of the poor, but it's involuntary versus voluntary. Is woke counterfeit being born again? When people say, they're woke, that means they're going to care about the world. Well, wait a second. When people get born again, they want to care about the world. But only the difference is theirs is without God, and theirs ends up setting up a tyranny. Is government redistribution of wealth counterfeit Christian charity? Is love your enemy replaced with cancel your enemy? And is forgiving offenses replaced with harboring offenses, inciting hate and riots? Is social justice counterfeit Bible justice? The Bible says no matter what somebody's race, sex, or whatever, you treat them all the same. When the they came to Peter, and Peter went to this Gentile Roman soldier's house. They all get filled with the Holy Spirit. And Peter says, the Lord has showed me that God is not a respecter of persons. But yet the whole woke social justice, intersectionality, critical race theory is what? It's respect of persons. It's all based on outward parameters. And here's a question. Is it better for someone to care for you because they love you? Because they're expressing their love to God by loving you? Or that they care for you because they're terrified of being canceled? Well, they're basically hypocritical. They really don't care about you, but what they care about is they're going to be canceled and have everybody say bad things about them. So it's an outside pressure versus an inward change.
Yeah.
You're caring about people not because your heart has been changed and you want to help them, but because you don't want to be canceled.
That's right.
And now, we talked about the Pilgrims. We talked about Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis Bacon. We talked about ancient Israel and their model of self-government. But in all discussions of socialism, you have to go back to the French Revolution. And so we had a revolution, France had a revolution. You know, France helped us in our revolution.
They did.
King Louis XVI sent his navy over. Do you know what France got in return for helping us? Nothing but debt. Lots and lots of debt. And then their crops failed for a couple years. And then the people blamed the king and queen and said, if only we chop off the heads of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, all of our problems will be solved. So they chop off their heads, and it does not get any better. Then the people say, well, let's chop off the heads of the royalty. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the wealthy. You have money, we don't have money, you're selfish and greedy. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You've got food and supplies, we don't have food and supplies, you're selfish and greedy. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra food and we don't have enough. And then they chop off the heads of the clergy because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. Then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it, somehow they're to blame. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris. And so the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity.
Yeah.
Now, fraternity is their word for socialism. The fraternity, the group, the collective, the state, the mob. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, equality is equal treatment before the law.
Right.
In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the group, the collective, the mob thinks you have too much stuff, it can use the power of the state to take away your stuff and kill you. And so Timothy Dwight is the president of Yale when all this is going on. And he writes, about the year 1728, when America was going through our Great Awakening revival, over in France, Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and introduced in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. The being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. You got property, you must have taken it. Chastity, natural affection, were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. Right? Now we're back to that sexual promiscuity being taught to the kids. Adultery, assassinations, poisonings, and other crimes of like infernal nature, like smashing windows and looting stores, were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. So if you are convinced that, so forget God's definition of what good is, if your political agenda, the education of youth, books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity, sort of like the modern, it's perfectly normal, those different sexual textbooks they're using. To destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God. Or maybe have some emergency where they got to shut down the house of God, right? Mm-hmm. So France called the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, and they tore down statues. The statue of good King Henry IV, who tried to patch up Protestants and Catholics, they tore it down. Wow. The St. Genevieve, here's a woman in 450 AD, Attila the Hun is scourging Europe with 500,000 men, wiping out city after city after city after city. He's headed toward Paris. She gets all of Paris to fast and pray, and Attila skips sacking Paris. So she's considered the patron saint of Paris. During the French Revolution, they dug up the bones of St. Genevieve and trashed them. They wanted to pull down all the history. And this is a concept called deconstruction, and every conquering country does this. It's where you portray the founders of a country negatively, so people emotionally detach from them. Then you get them into a neutral state where they're open-minded, they have no clue where they came from. And then you portray whatever future you're wanting to sell positively. It's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. You're still brushing with that old stuff? Haven't you read it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? Ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now you got the person in a neutral position. They're open-minded. What are all the toothpaste out there? Haven't been to the store for a while. And then you give them a pitch for your brand new tartar-controlled breath freshener toothpaste, right? So it's a drive neutral reverse process. And so that's called the 1619 Project, or Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, where they literally go into the classrooms and intentionally tell the kids everything negative they can about the Founding Fathers. Why? So that the kids emotionally detach from them. Now you got them into a neutral, and then you give them your pitch for LGBT or socialism or radical Islam.
Yeah.
And so Europe went through this. It went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods, to a secular Europe with the French Revolution. And free sex, anything goes, Napoleon spreads it all around, right? And now it's turning into a Sharia and a socialist Europe, with Muhammad being the #1 name for newborns. And yes, the government pays for your education, but if you score bad on a couple tests, and later you decide to apply yourself and you want to be a doctor, sorry, the government won't pay for it. I personally know a young man who went through this, and he wanted to be a doctor so bad, and he scored bad on a couple tests, and the doctors shut the door, and so now he's an occupational therapist. Carl Sandburg said, "When a nation goes down, one condition may always be found: they forgot where they came from." Now, this isn't just a Western civilization concept. China did this. So 3rd century BC, it's called the Warring States period. You have a half dozen Chinese kingdoms fighting, and one wins, led by Qin Shi Huangdi. And Qin Shi Huangdi was being criticized for doing things differently than they had been done for centuries before. And he got tired of being criticized, so he decided to destroy all records of how things were done before. Tens of thousands of bamboo annal books, because they wrote on strips of bamboo from top to bottom and wove them together. He had them all burnt. And his chancellor was Li Si, and he wrote in 213 BC. "I, your servant, propose that all historians' records, other than those of Quin's, be burned. If anyone under heaven has the copies of the classics of history, they shall deliver them to the governor for burning. Anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed, and anyone who has failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be sent to build the Great Wall." So this is the detaching. It's sort of like a gene replacement therapy for a culture. Take out the old history and identity so that you can put in a new. Now, Mao Zedong copied this in the 1960s, called the Cultural Revolution. Not just a revolution, culture. He wanted to destroy thousands of years of Chinese culture. And they did it through shaming. If you had any education, you were a doctor, lawyer, teacher, they would bring you in and shame you and have you confess your sin of being, a capitalist or whatever. And they rewarded the kids more if they had more blood on their clothes for killing the old people. And so they would just burn he destroyed the oldest Buddhist temple in China. He destroyed the old Great Gates of Beijing. And this is even a recent article. Xi Jinping, head of China, ordering erasure of Genghis Khan from Chinese history.
That's hilarious. Wow.
So in the 1200s, Genghis Khan's Mongolian.
Wow.
He conquers China and conquers from Korea to Hungary to Russia. It's considered the largest contiguous land empire in world history. But they were going to do an exhibition in Paris, and this Xi Jinping pressures Paris to cancel their, and now they're tearing down monuments and statues in all these towns to Genghis Khan, right? So they're tearing down statues over here, they're tearing down them over there. And Pol Pot did the same thing in Cambodia. He made 1975 the new year zero, said anything prior to that is irrelevant, and he killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history. He killed a third of his country. Over 2 million people. I was speaking at an event with a girl that was from Cambodia, and she's lived through all that. And but fundamental radical Islam does this, right? So whenever they would come into a country, they would destroy the pre-history. So the story is that when Amir ibn Alas invaded Egypt, and they discovered Alexandria, the oldest library in the world, that they sent message to Caliph Umar what to do with all these old books. And the story is, he said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant, because we have the Quran, so destroy them all. And supposedly took 6 months to burn them all. And then there was a sultan in the 9th century who was in Egypt, and he noticed these pyramids with tunnels that went to a stone wall. He goes, nobody builds a tunnel to a stone wall. There's got to be. So he had his men build a fire in front of the stone wall, keep it burning for weeks, and it weakened the stone, and they cracked through, and they found it all full of gold and all this old pagan stuff. And so they began to go through every temple and pyramid in Egypt and destroy it. And they're still doing it today. So when the ISIS went to Mosul, Iraq, they had the ancient Assyrian museum, and they destroyed it. So this is, again, 1619 project, Howard Zinn's People History of the United States. The goal is to, again, separate from the past, get people into a neutral so that they can push them into the future they have planned. And George Orwell, who wrote 1984, a book, he said, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. And so George Orwell goes on, I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never be possible for me to prove it, even when I did the falsification myself. After the thing is done, no evidence remains. Yeah. The only evidence is inside my own mind, and I don't know with any certainty that any other human being shares my memories. Yeah. And then George Orwell said, those who control the past control the future. That's the identity. Yeah. But whoever controls the present controls the past. Right. So if you can control the present, you decide what's in the history book about the past, and people draw their identity, their purpose in life from where they came from. Yeah. So French Revolution. Is this interesting?
Yes.
So they chop off all these heads. It was a campaign to erase the Judeo-Christian influence on French society. They destroyed the monuments, they desecrated graves, prohibited church meetings, canceled Christian schools. No public or private worship was outlawed. They had the nuns, the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, who ran the Hotel Dieu. It was one of the oldest hospitals in Europe, and it was in Paris. And they had hundreds of hospitals that they ran across Europe, these sisters. Well, during the French Revolution, they wouldn't embrace government-controlled healthcare, secular. And so they marched these nuns to the guillotine, and they were singing their church song. And one by one, they'd chop off a head, and there'd be one less person singing, and another less person singing, until finally they chopped off the last one. No more singing. Reminds you of those little sisters today that won't go along with the Obamacare and paying for abortions, and they have to go all fight up to the Supreme Court. So ministers and priests and those who harbored them were executed on sight. And a very similar thing happened in Mexico in 1917 with President Calles. Right? This was the secular government attacking the church, taking away church property, and there's a case where a priest went outside the church dressed in his garb to deliver communion, and they caught him and they executed him. And then there's a rural area, hundreds of miles away from the capital. They think they're safe. It's called the Vendée, and they send their secular French army to the Vendée, and they kill 300,000 men, women, and children. Considered the first modern genocide. So this became the model for every socialist takeover, that you kill off the old order. And it's okay to have a lot of violence, because then you start afresh. And Robespierre, who's the head of the French government at this time, he puts a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covered her with a sheet, and said, this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And they did not want done in the year of the Lord. So they made 1792 the new year one. And they didn't like a 7-day week because it went back to the Bible. So they canceled that. They came up with a 10-day week. It's called a decade week. Each day had 10 hours. This is the French Revolution clock. See, 10 hours, 100 minutes per hour, 100 seconds per minute. And they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system because you count with 10 fingers. They called it the number of man. And so every measurement is divisible by 10. They call it the metric system. So that's why I never really liked the metric system. So this French Revolution, there's no God anymore. And so who decides what's right and what's wrong? The mob, the state, the fraternity, the collective, the group, the social contract, right? And so out of this chaos rises what? A dictator. So democracy and republics without the people having morals and virtue ends in chaos and lawlessness, out of which the people say we want someone to come along and restore order, and someone says, I can do it, I just need emergency powers, and the rubber band snaps back and you get a dictator. Well, in France's case, they got Napoleon. And anyway, so Napoleon conquers Europe, 6 million people died, and then afterwards, one of the leaders of Germany was a bunch of kingdoms, and one of them was called Prussia. He didn't want to be conquered that easy again. And so he got a philosopher named Hegel to help strengthen the state. And so I'll go through these slides, and then I guess we'll have lunch. But so we go from the pilgrim idea of a covenant, what they got from ancient Israel, where people committed to caring for each other because they're accountable to God, you get rights from the God. But in the next century after the pilgrims, it turns into social contract. This is people in agreement with each other. There's no commitment to caring for each other. And the Age of Enlightenment, you have the scientific revolution. You have Copernicus discovering that the sun is the center of the solar system. You have Kepler discovering laws of planetary motion. I wrote a book about all this and called Miraculous Milestones. And Sir Isaac Newton discovering laws of optics, laws of gravity, and laws of motion. And so some theologians said, well, maybe God made everything with laws. And then, like a guy winds up a clock and sets it on a shelf, maybe everything's just running according to his laws. And so if God is there, he's distant. He's far removed. He's not involved. And so we go from the pilgrim idea of a covenant where you're accountable to a personal God to now this French Revolution social contract where you're in agreement with each other. And if God's there, he's distant. He's not involved. Well, in the next century, it turns into the French Revolution and a social contract with no God. So forget him being distant. He is not even there. And so it's just what we agree upon. And the next century turns into Marxism and socialism where the state is God. Right? You get your rights from the state. You're accountable to the state. And Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, says, when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. So once you get rid of God, the state becomes God.
That's right.
And then 100 years later in Germany, you have the Nazi, which is National Socialist Workers' Party. This is the New York Times. Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. And then you got Pol Pot in Cambodia. He said, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss.
Wow.
So your worth, your life is only of worth if the government thinks so. So Pilgrim Covenant under God, Age of Enlightenment is a contract, social contract with a distant God, French Revolution, social contract with no God, to the socialism where the state is God. Hegel said the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? Maybe like the 10 Commandments? Yeah, there is no God. There are no commandments. It's just what we agree upon. It's just a power grab by the deep state. If you help the people that are in power get more power, they think your life is worth something to them. If you challenge the people in power, they will use the power of the state to crush you. It's just a power grab by the state. Eisenhower put it this way. In many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. if the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights.
That's right.
The founding fathers had to refer to the creator to make the revolutionary experiment make sense. So in other words, do your rights come from the government or do they come from a source higher than the government? Our founding fathers went above the government's head. We get rights from a creator, you cannot take them away.
That's right.
But if there is no creator, your rights come from the government. What the government giveth, the government can taketh away. Anyway, so that's the first part of my book, where I talk about democracies and republics, self-rule, work. If the people have self-rule, they're motivated to have self-rule because they're accountable to God. You get rid of God, you have an uneducated, immoral populace that's going to turn into lawlessness. And in that lawlessness, people are going to want somebody to come along and fix it, and the rubber band snaps back, and you got some king or dictator or president or whatever. So this is a normal phenomenon. Throughout history, ambitious politicians have noticed this, and they've said, let's speed it along by intentionally creating crises, by intentionally removing morals and self-control, by intentionally introducing lawlessness, by intentionally getting people to panic in times of crises, because then they'll be more than happy to give up their freedoms so that the government can promise to fix it, but they usurp power. And so the second part of my talk is I go through that. Well, we talked about how democracies and republics are based on the people having morals and self-control and being educated, but when they give that up, it turns into lawlessness, and out of that, they want someone to come along and fix it. And that's when somebody comes along saying, I can fix it, but they end up concentrating power. Before you know, they're a dictator. Some politicians have figured this out and want to speed it along. And so we begin to see how there's an effort to create or capitalize on discord and chaos in order to consolidate control. And let's look at some examples. Psalms 133 says how good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. All right, what's the opposite? Proverbs 6 things the Lord hates: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands swift to shedding innocent blood, and he that soweth discord. Right, so we got unity, we got discord. And the devil sowed discord in heaven. I mean, think of it. Here you are in heaven, and he sowed discord. Got a third of the angels to rebel against God. And so when he's cast to earth, what does he do? Sow discord. And anyway, talks about Israel was a republic for the first 400 years, no king, until King Saul. They almost lost it, though, earlier than Saul, with Abimelech, the illegitimate son of Gideon. So Gideon helps defeat 100,000 Midianites. There is no threat to Israel. They're at peace. But Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech, and he goes to the town of Shechem, and he begins to sow discord. And what does he do? He engages in identity politics. Right? He says, is it better for you that all the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his brethren spake of him in the ears of the men of Shechem all these words, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. So forget whether or not he's good at ruling. It's just an identity thing. And so Abimelech takes money from the treasury to hire protesters and rioters to commit violence and to kill all his half-brothers. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons which followed him. And they went unto his father's house at Ophrah and slew his brethren. And the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. Well, that would have been the end had not somebody thrown a millstone over the wall and killed Abimelech. And but nevertheless, this is the first documented instance of identity politics, right? There's peace, and you go in there and you're sowing discord. And then you get a following, and you're paying your followers, and then you're rioting and getting involved in violence. And now let's fast forward to Italy. 500 years ago was a bunch of city-states: Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena. And they all had armies and fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop this infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So, if a prince conquers a city, the people of the city would hate him. But if the prince paid criminals to kill cows, burn barns, create crisis and terror, the people will panic and want someone to come along and fix it. And that's when the prince will come in and get rid of the very people that were causing the problems, and everyone would praise the prince as a hero. So the same way Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons, Machiavelli's idea was the prince would hire vain and worthless persons to create looting and crisis and so forth, so that the people would panic and want someone to come in and help. The prince would come in and take over. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire. Then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. They'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being it. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. Well, you know this quote a little more recently worded this way: you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. It is an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. Rahm Emanuel. And then Hillary Clinton remarked, the chief of staff for President Obama is an old friend of mine and my husband's, and he said, you know, never waste a good crisis. So you and I see a crisis, our response is how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, their response is how can we usurp power and rights away from the people for political gains to consolidate power. And now, we've talked about Abimelech, we talked about Machiavelli, and now let's look at Germany. In the early 1800s, Germany was a bunch of kingdoms. Saxony, Bavaria, Prussia, and they had armies and fought. And then Napoleon, conquered through there. And so the king of Prussia wanted to strengthen his state, and he needed a philosopher to help, and his name was Hegel. And Hegel taught at the University of Berlin. And so Hegel takes Machiavelli and turns it into an equation. You know how Germans like to make everything really organized, and so it's his thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. By the way, Charles Darwin credited Hegel with inspiring him to say, oh, these two different species, and then they can evolve. But who was a student under Hegel was Karl Marx at the University of Berlin. Matter of fact, Karl Marx was a member of the Young Hegelians, a radical student group following Hegel. So Karl Marx took Hegel and says, okay, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis is the status quo of a country. You create the antithesis. In other words, you sow discord. You create a problem that's real bad. And then everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Right? Then that becomes the new synthesis starting point, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then that's the new starting point. You create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And every time you settle for an answer, you're giving up a little more of your freedom, a little more of your independence, a little more to the government, until finally all the power is reconcentrated back into the state. And so how do you create discord? His idea was you send in agitators, agent provocateurs, provoking agents, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to find people with grievances, ethnically, religiously, economically, and stir them up to riot. And when the country gets panicky and confused enough, that's when they would come in to restore order, but they would take over. And so they'd organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners. They'd organize the poor against the rich, blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, Muslims against the Christians, Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really don't care who the two sides are, and they really don't care what the issues are. Their goal is to create a destabilizing crisis that makes everybody panic and be willing to beg for someone to come along and restore order, and that's when they change the form of government. Britain took over India this way. So 1714, a British guy lands in Bengal, which is sort of southeast of India. And the king was sick. This guy knew a little medicine, helped the king to recover. And the king's like, gee, what can I do? And he says, I'd like to open a trading post. Okay. And then the British start coming and trading. Well, then it turns into a trading fort. And then the British start getting involved in local politics. And then the British can't help but want to funnel some guns to one side, and then they funnel guns to the other side, and then the two sides beat each other up and get all bloodied, and then the British come in to restore order, and they end up taking over both. And then they do it again and again and again until they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population, and then they disarmed the entire country. And they tried doing that in America during the Revolutionary War, right? They would come into the Indians and promise them money for scalps, And so this... Richard Pipes wrote in Communism History, as Fidel Castro, the leader of communist Cuba, would explain, the revolution needs the enemy. The revolution needs for its development its antithesis. And if enemies were not liking, they had to be created, fabricated. In other words, you can't organize your people against something if there's nothing to organize against.
Right.
And we gotta all get together. Why? Well, no reason. No, there's this enemy. What if there are no enemies? We gotta create an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, this is the sowing of discord. So how did it start to come to America? Well, you got Karl Marx, middle 1800s. Now we got the late 1800s, and you have Chicago, a Pullman railroad car company that had a little village where the workers worked, shops for the workers to shop, paid them, with company script, and it was all this nice little community until orders for railroad cars dropped, and the people weren't getting paid, and so Eugene Debs comes over, and he's a socialist, and he organizes riots. And they destroy $80 million worth of railroad cars in 27 states all across America. Wow. Could you imagine rioting and burning things all across America? And he then founds the Socialist Party of America. And he runs for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920, one time from prison. And then in 1920 splits off the Communist Party USA. They run candidates for president every year up until 1940. What happens then? Democrat President Franklin Roosevelt makes a treaty with Stalin during World War II. So the Communist Party USA says, why should we be running our own candidates when here you have a Democrat president making treaties with Stalin, the head of the communist government over there? And so from that time on, they began to infiltrate the Democrat Party politics. Mm-hmm. And they're doing their best with the Republican Party as well. So let's look at Germany. 1920s, it was a republic, the Weimar Republic. A republic is where the people vote for representatives, right? It's the bottom-up form of government. And someone starts a political party. His name is Hitler. And the name of the party is the National Socialist Workers' Party, or National Arbeiter Sozialistisches Party. And it's better known as Nazi. And so he had a violent, under-the-table group associated with his party. They were called brown shirts. And they were an early version of groups that would go into the meetings of Hitler's political opponents and shout down the speakers and disrupt the meeting and just have chaos. And then they would lock arms and block access to buildings and block streets. Could you imagine people locking arms and blocking things? And then they went into the cities and they smashed the windows and looted and burned over 7,000 stores owned by Jews. It's the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. And then their capital got attacked, right? The capital set on fire.
Oh, my goodness.
And all done by this group that Hitler was stirring under the table to create. And in this confusion with these rioting and the Capitol being attacked, Hitler blames his political opponents, has them rounded up and canceled and deplatformed, right? Different words back then. But he arrested them and had them shot without a trial. When the dust settled, Hitler had no political opponents. And then he turns around and kills the brown shirts. Right? Doesn't need them anymore, kills them all off. And now, millions of people died, getting rid of Hitler. After World War II, Germany, France, England give independence to their former colonies, who form brand new countries with brand new leaders. And they're trying to piece together post-war life. And it looks promising, except the Soviet Union decides it doesn't just want communism running the Soviet Union, which is USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Socialist in there, right? And so they say, we don't want just it to run the USSR, we want it to run the world. And so after World War II, they began to send KGB agents into these brand new countries, and they would identify groups and break them into ethnic groups, religious groups, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, economic groups, racial groups, it really didn't matter. And they would classify them as victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would organize protests that they would escalate into riots and violence. And then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the new country for all of the problems. And then they would cultivate weak links in the military. And when the country got panicky and confused enough, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. Suddenly the violence would stop. And everybody would be happy for a short time until they realized we just gave up our freedoms.
Yeah.
And now we're being ruled by a puppet of the Soviet Union. And anyway, so all these countries fell: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and then China did the same thing in the Far East. And they would even, in co-opting the media, they would even have the media release false polling data prior to a rigged election. So when they did the rigged election, nobody would question it.
Yeah.
And so all these countries are called behind the Iron Curtain. And the president at the time is Truman. He does nothing. He thinks the United Nations that he helped form was going to bring world peace. And but the next president is Eisenhower. And he's faced with this problem. Eisenhower said the United Nations has seemed to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seems that it should be a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda, a weapon to be exploited in spreading what? Disunity and confusion. And so Eisenhower could either do nothing and let the Soviets keep taking over countries or fight fire with fire, and that's what he does. Iran sides with the Soviet Union. Their leader's Mossadegh, 1953. And Mossadegh decides to nationalize the oil industry. And your response is big deal. Well, wait a second. Britain has no oil. There's no oil wells in Britain. And so in 1908, they formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. BP, British Petroleum, is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And so when Iran takes the oil and sides with the Soviet Union, Britain is having an oil shortage. So they appeal to Eisenhower for help. Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax. And the CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He's an expert in foreign languages, and he goes over there, and what does he do? He recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams. And they stage protests and riots and attack mosques and co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh for all of the problems. And then they cultivate weak links in the military. And when the country gets panicky and confused enough, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replaced him with the Shah. The Shah had a claim to the throne from beforehand, so it was sort of like putting him back in. But nevertheless, the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala in 1954. The Congo, 1960, Dominican Republic, so some Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, 1973. And the KGB did the same thing, with Brezhnev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO, and Brezhnev hugging Castro and helping him to take over Cuba. And they took over countries in Latin South America, and FARC, and Colombia, and Venezuela, and so forth. And then hundreds of coup attempts in Africa. And they would send leaders to Moscow to be trained in all these communist tactics. And the Chinese did the same thing in the Far East. This is called the Cold War. And Now it's interesting, John Foster Dulles is our Secretary of State. His brother Alan Dulles is the head of the CIA. They're trying to mobilize America to realize of the threat with, the communists, because America is sort of happy after World War II and we don't want to think about that. And so they did an Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA began to feed stories to 25 major news organizations in America for the purpose of molding American public opinion against communism. And so we see this first instance of our media being connected with the CIA. And so this Cold War is now going on all around the world. Chris Matthews, in his last TV appearance, he got his hardball program, right, on MSNBC, and there is the Democrat primary debate, and one of the candidates was talking about socialism, and Chris Matthews said this: I remember the Cold War. I've seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe that if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. For whatever reason, they decided to take him off the air after this.
That's right.
Now, executions in Central Park, Castro had an executioner named Che Guevara. And Che Guevara actually said this: we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess, I discovered that I really like killing. Blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, and cold killing machine. A people without hate cannot triumph. So where the gospel says you forgive offenses, this wants to stir up offenses into hate. And it is a process. Those familiar with the Shiite Muslims, they have an annual festival called Ashura, where the founder of the Shiites was Ali, and he had a son named Hussein who was assassinated by the Sunnis. The Sunnis were founded by Abu Bakr, and so you have the Sunnis and the Shiites. Well, how did they keep this hate alive? Well, this Ashura is where the Shiite Muslims will whip themselves on the back. They will take knives and hit their forehead. They'll even have their sons, and they'll hit them, and they'll bleed down their face, and they'll get together and groan, sort of in a reverse pep rally, and they'll groan and cry and begin to weep and stir up this emotion of feeling bad that Hussein was murdered by the Sunni. And they've been able to keep that hate alive for over a millennium. And so where Jesus talks about forgive, matter of fact, Jesus says, if you don't forgive, you will not be forgiven.
That's right.
Right? And that this is the opposite, it's sort of an anti-gospel. And so let's look at another aspect. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. They also wrote this, that they are alchemists of the revolution. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious and more universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed. And in the end, commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. So you have the ruling class and the middle class, and then you have the commoners. Well, guess what? Plato's model is you have to get rid of the middle class. So all you have left is the ruling class and all the commoners. And so when Lenin took over Russia, he killed off the middle class. They were mostly kulak farmers, K-U-L-A-K. And he wrote a letter that says, and kill the kulaks, and don't just kill them, hang them in the town square, and P.S. get tougher men, right? And so maybe they killed them. Now, didn't realize that once he killed off all the farmers, they didn't have any food. So in 1921-22, they had millions die from a famine. But nevertheless, you had to get rid of the middle class. And so this was a 1934 Chicago Tribune article. And it's got a picture of Trotsky, one of the communists, and it says, plan of action for U.S. Spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery. bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, jump the Constitution, and declare dictatorship. It worked in Russia. So this is called the Great Reset. You want to spend all kinds of money to have stimulus to try to recover the economy, but your goal is not stimulus. The goal is not to recover the economy. The goal is to print so much money that it bankrupts the country.
That's right.
And once the country's bankrupt, they're going to beg for the government to come in and restore order. And the government says, okay, we'll give you a handout dole, but it's in exchange for all your freedoms. Very similar to Joseph in Egypt, right? You know, that they will give you the land for the grain for the land. And so Hoover, during the Great Depression, tried to do voluntary organizations to come to the rescue of the country. But he was sabotaged in all of his efforts to bring recovery because the other party wanted to put in FDR with all of his big government programs, all the work programs, all those alphabet soup type programs. David Horowitz, former communist, now author, said, the issue's never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. Civil rights, women's rights is never the real cause. Women, blacks are only instruments in a larger cause, which is power. Battles over rights and other issues, according to Walensky, should never be seen as more than occasions to advance the real agenda, which is the accumulation of power. Right, so people that actually think it's, you know, something to do with the Pledge of Allegiance or Occupy Wall Street or, you know, safe spaces on college campuses because you used a pronoun that offended me. I mean, you know, that's all. The real big issue is they want to, and Saul Alinsky says that you can't keep your base mobilized emotionally for an indefinite long period of time. So you got to keep switching up the issues.
Right.
And so they just hopscotch from one issue to the other, but it's the same people that they're motivating to do this stuff.
Yeah.
Vladimir Lenin said that those that believe that it's actually the issue, he called them useful fools or useful idiots. You know, the people that show up and those guys that go on the microphone on the street and says, why are you here demonstrating? And they're like, we really don't know. I got a text from my liberal professor that said, you know. Now in 1980, a Soviet spy, whatever, named Yuri Bezmenov defected. Came to America and he spilled the beans on their strategy. And he says it's 4 steps. He says, people think of KGB like James Bond. He goes, no. He says, it's really not that exciting. He says, our job was to identify public opinion molders in the country. In other words, America could not be defeated on the battlefield. We won a 2-front world war. And so their idea was to rot us from within.
Yep.
Right? Weaken us from within. It's like, you know, you climb in a tree and you put your foot on a branch, you know, and it's nice and hard, but if that branch is rotten, you know, it just cracks off.
Right.
And so, so who are the public opinion molders? They would be in media, education, and the pulpit. He says this is a 20-year period where you win these leaders over toward your socialist views. You get them to start mouthing the socialist views. And when this season is over, it's so effective, you can take someone over to the Soviet Union, show them a concentration camp, they won't believe their own eyes. He says the next phase is a 5-year period of destabilization where you get the country to spend, and weaken its military and weaken its banking and so forth. And then you have a 6-month period where you take some incident and you fan it into a national crisis and just have it go across the country like a flame, and then you do your coup or your rigged election, and then you get people to become normalized to the new state of affairs. And then you wait until you do the next installment over and over again. And so during this time, Representative from Florida, Albert Herlong, read into the congressional record 45 goals or tactics of the Communist Party. One of them was, you know, infiltrate schools, another infiltrate both political parties, infiltrate the media and the television, the bank. One of them was infiltrate the churches, replace revealed religion with social religion, discredit the Bible. Now, one of the individuals is Manning Johnson. You can go to his website and you can download his entire book. He was a black man in the 1930s that got disillusioned and he joined the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. And he was part of the Communist Party for 10 years. He even ran for Congress in New York as a communist. But then he said after 10 years, he realized that they really didn't want to help his people. He lists instances in the books where a group of black businessmen wanted to build a real estate development and have it be top-notch, fountains, bridges, and he says that they would sabotage it. They wouldn't let them do it. He says then they wanted to build a hospital. He goes, Jews have hospitals, other people, we were to have a hospital that's financed by black Americans. And he says they sabotaged that, and he realized, you know what, they really don't want to help our people. They just want to use us to stir division. And so he defects. He gives testimony before the U.S. Congress. He writes a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. The foreword to the book is written by Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt. So in his book, he talks about how the communists in Russia would go into the schools and churches and get them to spit on the Bible and kick the Bible and get rid of God. He says they couldn't do that in the minority communities in America because the people were so into believing the Bible. So they made a strategy of changing the gospel. He said this, the new line went like this: Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. That is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are modern day fighters against capitalists or money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like the communists. So forget the gospel that God's a just God, we're sinners, we deserve his judgment, and Jesus, his only begotten son, died on the cross to pay for all of our sins. Forget that. We're just going to have Jesus be an agitator. You know? And Solzhenitsyn, who spent 11 years in Gulag camps in Russia, he says, I call upon America to be more careful with its trust. Prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. Now, liberation in Latin America is called liberation theology. And again, Jesus was completely innocent and he was crucified. And what were some of the last words he uttered? Father, forgive them. And then the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those. And so, yet this social talks about building upon the offenses and never forgetting them, and to bring division, to sow discord. And now we're coming a little closer to the present. Chicago has Al Capone, and he has a hitman named Frank Nitti. And this hitman had a young guy who rode around with him named Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky noticed how all they had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would panic, get into fear, and they would be willing to surrender their freedom to the mob and pay protection extortion money. And so Saul Alinsky applied this to politics. Yep. And so Saul Alinsky says the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy. For unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. Right? If enemies aren't there, you got to create them, you know. Now, it's interesting, Saul Alinsky has an acknowledgement in the front of his book. I have a copy of the book, you can read it, and it says this: lest we forget, at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment, did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. So here's Lucifer sowing discord in heaven. He wrote a book, Rules for Radicals, on how to sow discord on earth.
Using Lucifer.
And one of the tactics they use is called psychological projection. Sigmund Freud coined the term. He's a psychologist. It's where rude people call everyone they don't like rude. That they deny in themselves a negative quality, and yet they attribute that exact quality to someone else, right? And so we've all met someone like that, right? You know, and so little kids do this. I didn't start the fight, you did. Or wife beaters will beat the tar out of their wife, say it's your fault because you provoked me.
Yeah.
And Sharia men will rape a woman and say it's your fault because you tempted me.
Yeah.
So the attacker blames the victim.
Yeah.
So it's blame shifting. And so it's worked its way into all kinds of things. Politically, in 1788, the king of Sweden wanted to invade Russia, but his parliament would not approve funding. So he had the tailor of the Swedish orchestra sew Russian uniforms and had some of his soldiers put on the Russian uniforms and attack a Swedish outpost. And the news picked it up and fanned it into a flame. The Russians had attacked Sweden, and so the parliament panics and just votes through the funding. And so Hitler wanted to invade Poland in 1939. Public opinion wouldn't support it internationally. So he has Nazis dress up in Polish uniforms and attack a German village. And the news media picks it up and says, oh, the Polish attacked Germany. He used that as an excuse to invade. Stalin did the same thing. There was an anti-Stalinist movement in 1931 gaining momentum. And Stalin didn't know how to stop him. But then Stalin had a friend, Sergei Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad, who was praising Stalin, but he was getting too popular for Stalin's comfort. So Stalin decided he would assassinate his friend, Sergei Kirov, and blame it on the anti-Stalinists. Nobody would suspect him, their friend, and everybody would suspect the anti-Stalinists because they didn't like him anyway. He used that as an excuse, not just to silence and to deplatform, but to kill over 1 million people. All of his political opponents. So this is a real strategy. A couple other instances. Japan wanted to invade China. And they claimed that one little railroad track they had in China had an explosion. So they used that as an excuse to go in and kill over 100,000 in Nanking, China. Later they did an investigation. There was no railroad explosion. And in 1955, same thing in Istanbul. So you had Greek neighborhood, been there for centuries, millennium, and the Sharia fundamentalists wanted to get rid of it. They planned to blow up the home of Ataturk, who was the father of the modern Republic of Turkey, and his home was in Greece. And they were going to blow it up and blame it on the Greeks, and then use that as an excuse to attack the Greek community in Istanbul. The house never got blown up. But the news media ran with the story, fake news. They ran with the story anyway, blaming the Greeks, and they stirred it up, and they destroyed hundreds of businesses and churches and raped and pillaged until finally all the Greeks moved out. So this is a strategy where you infiltrate your opponent's rallies, let's say, and then you have them commit some violence that you can blame on the innocent person, but you can use that as an excuse to censor them and deplatform them and go after them and silence them and all their supporters. So it's called psychological projection. It's every day in the news. They blame you for what they're guilty of, right? So David Axelrod was a campaign manager for a couple presidents before, and David Axelrod said on NPR Radio 2014, he says, in Chicago politics, we have a tradition where you throw a brick through your own campaign office window and then call a press conference to accuse your opponent.
Yeah.
So you commit the crime, but you accuse it on others. And so, anyway, Nero set fire to Rome and blamed it on the Christians, and I just got done telling you these other stories. This is interesting. So, in the book, Let Them Call Me Radical, Saul Alinsky, college students, student activists in the 1970s sought out Alinsky to plan a protest of a scheduled speech by George H.W. Bush, then a U.S. representative to the United Nations, a speech in defense of Nixon administration's Vietnam war policies. Students told Alinsky they were thinking about picketing and disrupting Bush's address. Alinsky replied, "That's the wrong approach. Instead, go to hear the speech dressed as members of the Ku Klux Klan. And whenever Bush said something in defense of the Vietnam War, they should cheer and wave placards reading, 'The KKK supports Bush.'" And this is what the students did with very successful results, right? So you infiltrate and you, and I mentioned Stalin, and he did that. And now this is something I found fascinating. Marketing in the 1800s was Wells Fargo wagon, and then it was Sears catalog. And how did they sell stuff? They listed every single detail they could about the product. But then in the early 1900s, you had marketing that came up with this understanding that forget listing the attributes of a product, you just make it look like everybody's using it. And the perfect example is Crisco oil. Matter of fact, they not only didn't list, they specifically did not list what went into that product. Who knows what Crisco oil is made out of? Cottonseed oil, right? In Texas, they're harvesting cotton, and they would have piles of seeds. Well, what do you do with the seeds? Some guy came up with the idea of pressing the oil out of them and then boiling it to bleaching it and so forth, and then make the skirt. And they didn't want to put, because they use cottonseed oil for like machinery in factories. Nobody ate it. And so they created a term on the label called vegetable-based. So here you had listing the attributes. In Crisco, they did not list the attributes, but it was so popular because of this marketing campaign, it put the lard business out of business.
Yeah.
And so this idea is all you have to do is make it look like everybody's using it, and people don't even know the truth of what's in it. Then 1938, a phenomenon. It's called Orson Welles' the radio drama War of the Worlds. It's based on H.G. Wells' book, where and it starts off, we interrupt this program to announce that New Jersey's been invaded by Martians. And it spreads panic and fear around the entire nation instantly.
Yeah.
Everybody's running outside looking at Martians. And so here you have this marketing of a product nationally without saying what's in it. And now you have this instant fear that spreads across the country. And so we're beginning to see how you can manipulate masses of people. And then there's the movie Gaslighting. It was Ingrid Bergman, Gary Cooper, and it was this widow who marries this guy, and her mother was a famous actress with lots of money and has an attic in their English apartments that nobody's gone into since she's died, but this new husband married her because he thinks there's jewels up there. And so he would put her to bed. I guess back then they had separate bedrooms, and so he puts her, in her room, and then he goes, but he sneaks out, walks around the neighborhood, climbs up some ladder, goes across a couple of roofs, goes into the attic from a window, and he turns on the lamp so he can hunt through this stuff for these jewels. Well, when he turns on the gas in the attic, the gas in her room goes down. And so she tells her husband about this, and he goes, no, you're seeing things. It's not going down, but every night it happens. And he thinks, maybe you're going crazy. Maybe you're going insane. And he takes her to a psychiatrist and everything. And she's convinced that she is going crazy. And finally, Gary Cooper follows the guy one night, sees where he's going, and it breaks the story and so forth. But it became a word in our vernacular of gaslighting. It's the creating of a false worldview to push a political agenda. And Goebbels in Germany capitalized on this. So now we have marketing techniques to make it look like everybody's doing it. Then you have fear, right?
Yeah.
And then this creating of a gaslighting effect. So Goebbels orchestrated these huge assemblies in Germany, and they would begin to give the Hitler salute in the front and work its way back. And everybody would see everybody else giving the Hitler salute, and they would feel pressured to give the Hitler salute. And then everybody would see you giving it, and then they would give it. And it manipulated this mass, gaslighted, created impression of everybody doing it. And then you add in fear, the fear of the war. And this was studied again in Korea, World War II, prisoners of war. And these guys came out brainwashed. And they said, how did they do it? Well, they found out that they would put them in a room, and they would have them go through some deprivation and some crises and fear. But then they would use techniques of shaming. They sort of got this from the Chinese, but they would have you, they would shame you for being a capitalist. And then they would have you confess your sin of being a capitalist. And then they would, you'd have to repent of your capitalist supremacy. And then they would manipulate this group pressure, because as soon as they got, one guy to cave and another guy to cave, and then they would be using their pressure to cause the other guys to cave. And then they would all begin to change their whole worldview. This was studied after the war in America. It's called the Solomon Asch Conformity Experiment. And they did it on college campuses and classrooms. And the teacher would put 2 cards on the front desk. One card simply had 1 line, the other had 3 lines. One longer, one shorter, one the same. And they would pull 8 students into the room. 7 had been paid ahead of time to be actors. 1 was a naive participant. And they would go around the room, and one by one, the paid actors would stand up and convincingly say that the shorter line is actually equal to the other line. And by the time it got around to the 8th naive participant, 30% of them would deny their own eyes and go along with the group. They would doubt their perception. They would doubt that they would think that, well, they're more older than I, they must know something I don't know. But they would deny their own eyes just to fit in with the group.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, they did find that if just one of the other persons disagreed, it would go from 30% down to 5%. But this is a real fear. So now we see deleted big tech efforts to sway election. Now it's all gone online. Everybody wants to be liked and followed. Nobody wants to be unfriended and deleted and canceled and so forth. And so now they're beginning online creating this group gaslighted impression of what everybody believes and deleting anybody that disagrees so it can put this psychological pressure for everybody to go along with the group.
Yeah.
And now this is a real fear. You know the Bible story? Peter, after having been with Jesus 3 years, publicly denied Jesus when asked by an unnamed girl so he would not be rejected by a group of strangers hanging around a fire outside of the high priest's house. I mean, if it was just Peter and the girl, I don't think, but here Peter's like looking at all these people and they're all looking at him and wanting to not be rejected by a group is a very powerful motivation that has been co-opted by those with a political agenda. And now that they control mass media, it's being used on a gaslighted national stage, no different than Goebbels' huge events or the War of the Worlds with this national, but they've taken this marketing. Now, I ran for Congress 3 times. You would want somebody that knew how to market your message, right? You would say, okay, I'm pro-family, okay, let's design something here, and let's, well, now it's taking that ability to push another step. And so we all want approval. When Cain's offering was rejected, it says his countenance fell. His pride was hurt. He was offended. He was embarrassed. Well, there was only his brother and his parents and God, but that was enough. Out of that embarrassment, instead of him repenting, he got filled full of hatred and anger, wanted to murder his brother that had the revelation of the Lamb. But this approval can be manipulated. But Jesus says we have to, the gospel says to lose the fear of man and just have the fear of God. Right? You come out from the world. Jesus says you have to love me more than being loved by your mother, sister, brothers, or any other group. It's almost like God puts us in situations to see which way we're going to go, right? That, a girl's dating a guy. How does she know if the guy likes her or not? Well, if she chooses her over somebody else, or chooses her over the job, or chooses, right? It's the guy's faced with a choice, and she sees he makes this choice this way for me versus whatever the other choice is, right? God, lets us get into this choice. It's either fear of man or fear of God. Mm-hmm. And the whole world is moving in this direction, and we decide we're going to stand up for the Lord. And now we see these crises. Democracy in republics, without people having morals, ends in chaos. And out of that chaos, people feel insecure. That's when power is usurped. And so we see these different chaoses that have happened across the country. And in some areas where they have difficulty getting chaos to go, they import people that have a predisposition to rioting. But let's look at the COVID response a little closer. The very first thing was what? Let criminals out of jail. I don't know if you noticed that in the news, but all of a sudden, criminals are out. Really? You couldn't just transfer them somewhere else? You had to let them go? Then the next thing happened is crime goes up in the big cities.
Yeah.
Crime and chaos. What happens next? Well, some people feel unsafe and they move out. Who moves out? Well, maybe those with families and children. Pro-family people, they tend to belong more to one political party, right? And who's left in the city? Well, maybe more people that are dependent on government entitlements. Well, they tend to belong more to the other political party. And then businesses are closed and looted and vandalized, and the government does nothing. Well, guess what? Then pro-business people begin to move out of the city. And in presidential election years, whoever wins the big city ends up winning the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. You have a clear advantage to one political party in the COVID response of having crime going up in the cities and people moving out. And state-wise, so you have some states where those people that have a little higher incomes and they can afford to move, family people, business people, they all move out. Fine, let them move out. Because what happens? They get a monopoly on the state politics. We think, well, would they really do that? Anyway,
Yes.
now in winding up, so for most of world history, it's ruled top down by tyrants. And I go through this in my book, Change to Change, and Who is the King in America? Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultans, Tsars, Nimrods. And as the time goes on, the kingdoms get bigger. Because with military advancements, the tyrant can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they're killing with bronze weapons, or iron weapons, or a phalanx spear, or a scimitar sword, or gunpowder. The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature. And the King of England had the biggest at the time, and America's founders broke away. But now we have these socialists and communists and the Sharia impulses and so forth. Now, what made America unique? We had a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top-down, ruled by these dictators, it's bottom-up, ruled by we. And I go through this in my book, Who Was the King? But where did America's founders get the idea from colonial New England? Where did they get their idea from? Their pastors. Where did they get it from? From the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt before they got King Saul. Total unique in world history, where you have a nation with millions of people and no king. And it worked because every citizen was taught the law. Remember, I did the little app. Everybody downloads the app. And so it's the difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree, where every root and every little capillary root sucks in nutrients to help keep this thing alive. So every citizen is needed. So who's the king in America? Signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Moore, said the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Mm-hmm. Chief Justice John Jay said the people are the sovereign of this country. Another signer, James Wilson, said sovereignty resides in the people. They have not parted with it. Abraham Lincoln said the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. I love this quote from Grover Cleveland. The sovereignty of 60 millions of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself. A manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. So in other words, we're going back to this ancient Israel model. You get your own private property, you get your own land, right? And it's bottom up. So who's the king in America? We are. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler or co-king. James Wilson, a signer of the Constitution, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Not to vote is to abdicate the throne. Romans 13, well, every person must be subject to the governing authorities. Okay, well, who's the ultimate governing authority in America? We are. The politicians are our servants. We hire them and you fire them. How silly would it be for a king to obey his janitor? Right? The king doesn't obey the servant. Right? In America, we the people are the king. The politicians are our servants. We hire them, we fire them. And so imagine visiting a king, maybe in the Old Testament, and you're going through the streets of Jerusalem, and you're witnessing murder, rape, and crime. You finally get into the king's chamber, and he looks all worried. He looks up at you, and he says, did you see all that crime coming in here? I wish someone would fix it. Mm-hmm. You like reach over, tap him on the shoulder, say, excuse me, you're the king. Mm-hmm. This is your kingdom. I think you're the one accountable to God to fix this mess.
That's right.
That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix this mess. Hello, have a finger reach through the screen and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one that's accountable to God to fix it. Anyway, so in America, you get to be the king of your life. So our founding fathers, for all their faults, they gave us a present. And that present was, you get to be in charge of your life. And all of us together get to be in charge of the country. And then you have the opportunity of willingly submitting your life to Jesus, the King of Kings. Right? And that word willing is really important. So instead of it being forced from the top down, it's willingly. So in Psalms it says, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. And So Jesus has made us kings and priests. And so we're all little kings, and we get to throw our crowns at the feet of Jesus, the King of Kings. And who are the counselors to the king? I love this picture, 379 AD, the Roman Empire is Christian, right? Constantine, 325, 313 stopped the persecution, but now to the 379. You have a Christian Roman emperor named Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, Italy, and the pastor is St. Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose. Could you imagine what it would be like being Ambrose and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Mm-hmm. Guess what? That's exactly what we have in America. In America, the majority of the people are Christian. Now, in 1965, it was 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, and 3% Jews, so 96% believe the Bible. Over time, it's been going down, so right now it's only 65%. And so it's the wrong direction, but 65% is still the majority. Yeah. So in America, the people are the king. 65% of the people identify as Christians. And so that makes the pastors counselors to the king. Anyway, I love this quote from Chief Justice John Jay. Your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal of only you and your creator, or your creator and yourselves. So if I were to pick one quote to sum up what makes America great, it's this quote right here. Your lives, your liberty, your property are at the disposal of you and God. You and God get to decide what you want to do with your life. And Reagan put it this way: in this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. Here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. So you get to decide what you want to do with your life, and then all of us together decide what's going to happen in the country. And this is a gift that our founders gave us. We're all full of faults. The founders were humans. They had faults, but they gave us a present, and that present is you get to decide what you want to do with your life. You don't have a socialist government in Europe saying, I'm sorry, you scored bad on a test, you can no longer pursue that career. Or in Islamic countries, where if you're a Christian, you can never hold a job higher than a Muslim. And in some of the Sharia countries, that's the way it is. In India, they have the caste system. And there's about 7 major castes. The lowest is the untouchables, Dalits. And even though it's not legal, it's still culturally observed. And if you're in that lowest class, you don't have the same rights and freedoms as a Brahmin. They're near divinity in that Hindu belief system. Equality is not built in. In communist countries, it's based on your utility. If you are useful to the state, you are worth more. If you are not useful to the state, you are worth less. In America, you're worth something, not based on what you can do, but it's based on you being made in the image of God. And anyway, pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. A republic is where the people are king ruling through representatives. So when we pledge allegiance to the flag, we're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. Right. And when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest the system where I participate in ruling myself. It's like, really? Now, I love this Lord of the Rings movie. There's a scene of a king, Theoden, who has a spell cast on him. Gray hair, gray eyes, he looks out of it. And he has 2 counselors. One is this greasy guy named Wormtongue, who's whispering in the king's ear saying, stay asleep, don't wake up, don't get involved. And then there's another counselor to the king named Gandalf, and he casts the devil out of the king. And right before your eyes, the king starts to come to, and he looks around. He says, dark have been my dreams of late. It's like, yeah, you've been out of it with the spell cast on you. And he says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. So in America, the people are the king, and they've had 2 sets of counselors. One tells the king to go to sleep, shirk your responsibility, don't get involved in what's going on. Just focus on your own personal relationship with God and forget what you're handing to your kids. Proverbs says that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. But another set of pastors throws ice water on their congregation and says, wake up, you don't just have the right to vote in America, you're going to be held accountable to God for what happens in America. Yep. You're the king. So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. We can all agree upon that. But the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. If you're really convinced the gospel is the answer, you're going to be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. If the socialist woke movement gets in charge, they're going to redefine sin. Right? And they're going to make it a sin for you to believe the gospel. Mm-hmm. You say, really? Yeah, the Bible says Jesus himself Okay, he's the Savior. He's the one that died on the cross. The word Christians come from Christ. This is the Christ. Jesus himself said, in the beginning, God made them male and female. Yet they're trying to guilt trip you into saying if you're really Christian, you'll tolerate them teaching that you could be any sex. So if I'm really Christian, I'll let them teach something Jesus would never teach. So if I'm really Christian, I won't act like Christ. I mean, they try to guilt trip Christians into being more Christian than Christ. Right? But Jesus says, if you allow one of these little ones that believes in me to stumble, it's better than a millstone you put around your neck and you'll be thrown in the depths of the sea. So now it's getting serious. Martin Luther King says the church is the conscience of the state. So it's supposed to be addressing every single issue. And Bill Owens was with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so in times of crises, people turn to Christ. And then in times of crises, leaders are raised up. Yeah. So how many of you tend to pray more when things are going fine or when things are not going fine? We tend to pray more. We need to pray the same amount all the time. That's right. But human nature's. And so if he wants people to turn to him. If he forces us to turn to him, it's no longer free will. So he don't force us, but he does have plan A and plan B. Plan A is he blesses us. We turn to him out of gratefulness. Yeah. If that doesn't work, there's plan B. He withholds the blessings. He lets things get a little tough, and we turn to him out of desperation. His goal is to have us turn to him. But it's also in times of crises that leaders are raised up. So what are the Bible stories we love the best? God's people are in a crisis. Here's Moses with a couple million unarmed people, and the most powerful military in the world is bearing down on them with chariots and swords. And Moses, 80 years old, stands up with his staff and says, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves come in. And then there's David, right? You got Goliath and the Philistines, and you got this teenager, right? We love the stories where it looks hopeless and God raises up little nobodies. And, someday you'll be dead and you'll be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise when we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years, and you get a chance to meet Moses. Maybe you're walking the streets of gold. Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Moses will probably have a pretty nice place. Mm-hmm. Probably have one of the big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it, Moses, burning bush in the wilderness can burn out and logs in the fireplace. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think. And I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I said, I was thinking about something else. I don't know. But imagine being there in Moses' living room. All the small talk's over. You say, Moses, tell us that story again. And the room will get quiet, and he'll stand up and goes, well, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh was charging in. We were unarmed, and I held up my staff, and the waves came in. We're going to just be spellbound. We're going to be quiet. And then we're going to see David. Tell us your story. Then Gideon, tell us your story. 100,000 Midianites, and I only had 300. And one by one, it's going to be really exciting. They're all going to tell their stories. And then everyone in the room is going to look at you. Say, it's your turn. Tell us your story. I'd hate for any of us to be up there and say, well, I threw some bucks in the offering plate, or I turned the channel when those girls came on or something. No, I was going to, my country was going down the drain. And they were killing babies in the womb, and they were wanting to change the definition of God's definition of sex and marriage. And I said, enough. And whether we turn it around or not, we're going to try. I liken it to, I studied lots of history, and every generation has a crisis. Bubonic plague, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, World War I, II. Every generation has a crisis, and the crisis is an opportunity for people to show whose side they're on, basically. So it's sort of like a self-sorting out of the sheep and the goats. It's not the ultimate sorting out of the sheep and goats, but it's sort of like, so in freshman chemistry class, you have a beaker with a solution, and you pour in a catalyst that creates a reaction, and some stuff precipitates and gets heavy and falls to the ground, and other stuff gets effervescent, it turns into bubbles and floats to the top. Yeah. The period we're living in is the solution. The catalyst is the crises for our period. And it just reveals, are we going to precipitate and get heavy and drop out? Or are we going to get effervescent and say, God, use me, and rise up above it and have great things happen? Whether we turn it around or not, if we turn this around, there'll be another crisis. Yep. If we get through that, there'll be another crisis. That's right. Remember when the Soviet Union was the big crisis, then it's gone. I mean, if we get past this, there'll be another one. The wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. And the crisis of our era is the good Lord giving us an opportunity to manifest in the physical world what we believe in our hearts. And it's an exciting time to be alive.
Amen.
So with that, I'll quit. God bless you.